please join me in saying our chalice lighting words, which you can find in your order of service as we light this chalice. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light the beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
Good morning. Good morning, Karen. I want to share with you this morning a story I just heard told to me by a guy named Paul. Now, Paul is the president of the board for one of the UUA districts are coming together, 4 or 5 of them, and they are becoming regional boards. So Paul was explaining that his board was kind of in a lot of transition and people weren't listening to each other, and he had a retreat coming up. So he decided to hire an outside facilitator to run the retreat for them. Now when they got there, the first thing the facilitator said to them was, all right, here's the exercise we're going to do. I want you each to work independently. You take a piece of paper and you draw on the piece of paper where you have been, and then I want you to draw where we are going. And then when you're done with that, I want you to take these noise makers and make a lot of noise with them so that everybody knows to finish up. They all set to it. And Paul said actually that he's not much of an artist, so he got done relatively quickly. And he takes his noise makers and he's making this noise. He feels like the more he does it, the more irritating and embarrassed he is for himself making this noise. And you can tell that all the artists around him feel rushed. Then as more people join in, it's like this cacophony of irritating sound going on. And then said, something changed. That all of them in that group started making rhythms together. And that cacophony of sound turned into this music that they were offering one another. And in the end, what happens, he said, is with that music, people felt encouraged rather than discouraged. You know what, though? I think that's why we come to church. I think there are so many times in life where you have hard work in front of you. We have hard work in front of us here, and with a big transition. But something is different about being with all of us. I think more often than not, we actually do make music together instead of a cacophony of sound. So as we go through this transition together this year, I do want to bow to my fellow musicians and say thank you and honor that great gift that we offer one another. Welcome to our celebration of life. It's so good to be with all of you today. We are going to sing our first hymn, which I believe is Wake Now My Senses, number 298. Oh!
Every day I swept. I was cloaked in a white kimono, matching long white skirt, white socks, white flip-flops, standard attire for a Shinto priest in training. And the gray gravel that filled the pathways led up to the main shrine and wove throughout the grounds to connect all of the buildings. And since the shrine was at the base of a mountain, it had many tall trees that would shed leaves overnight onto that gray gravel. And in the morning, it was the job of every priest to grab a bamboo broom and start sweeping. When the priest assigned to be my guide during my 2-week visit to Japan this August told me about sweeping, he made certain distinctions. He explained that while cleaning in America was a menial and undesirable job, in Japan it was a part of the core of the culture. Everyone must clean. It's good for your body and it's good for your mind, he said. So I was handed a broom and I got to work. Every morning and evening as the shrine opened and closed, I swept. And the swish of those stiff broom bristles against the rocks and the leaves could be heard up and down the pathway as several priests and I swept almost in unison. With the broom in my hands, all I could focus on were the leaves and the gentle back and forth motion I made up the path. My mind was clear and I broke a sweat at the same time, so I thought that my guide was really onto something. But before I got to sweeping, I might have told you all of the differences that lay between me and the Shinto priests or the Japanese people in general. To start, I was taller than most of them, so their clothes didn't fit me when they gave them to me. They were too short. I also didn't like to eat fish or raw eggs for breakfast, which many people seem to enjoy. And I spoke English, while it seemed like all of a sudden the whole world was in Japanese, a language in which I could say good morning, but I couldn't tell which sign said women's room and which sign said men's room. And the list could go on. They had etiquette and rules about when you wear your shoes and how you eat and when and how you bow to another person. In the beginning, I even felt strange in worship, mostly because everyone was required to sit back on their feet and kneel. And I also was listening to people recite classical Japanese from memory in 90-degree heat. And so I began to question in my first few days there if I might ever find connection to this place and to these people. Because in truth, I felt out of place, out of time, out of sorts. I just felt like I didn't belong. And that's kind of one of the worst feelings that you can feel. But at the same time, I also felt this enormous privilege for having this scholarship to study Shinto at a real shrine for 2 weeks in the mountains of central Japan. So I had to make the most of it. And in doing so, I had to search for common ground with people who, although they were so kind and hospitable towards me, felt completely other to me. I had to discover that Mother Teresa was right in locating the source of the world's problems. She said, "We have forgotten that we belong to each other." There are numerous things today that constantly reinforce the opposite idea, that we do not belong to each other. Reality TV shows pit people against one another to compete for love and money and fame and popularity. We see images on the news of Muslims dressing and acting differently from us, mostly in ways that are designed to bring about fear. We are bombarded with the ongoing duel between our political left and political right in a system that lacks not only compromise but conversation. Enemies and competitors are created at every corner, and the story of us and them is alive and well. It's played out loudly on TV, movies, and everywhere online. It's in most nations and religions, and that includes us. Yes, even we, awesome UUs, are partly responsible for widening the gap between us and them. We sometimes proclaim that we act in a certain right and just way while declaring ourselves separate from those who don't act in the same way. Eboo Patel, an author, interfaith leader, and devout Muslim, examined this in speaking to General Assembly, our annual UU gathering this past June. He discussed the future of the interfaith movement and UU involvement in it. He began by praising us for being risk takers and movement builders. He said that the idea of difference as enriching is woven into our tradition. In fact, we even see difference as holy. And we live this out by teaching it to our children and youth, helping them to gain an appreciative knowledge of other religious traditions. And at this point, everybody in the crowd was smiling, feeling pretty good, patting ourselves on the back a little bit. And then he, went in for the zing. And he reminded us that interfaith cooperation is not about theological liberalism and political progressivism. And he was able to say this because he had an eye-opening interview in 2010 where he was zinged by renowned journalist Christiane Amanpour. In attempting to address the rise of religious violence since 9/11, Amanpour asked Patel point blank, "What has all your work done?" This question, while artfully dodged at the time, really shook Patel and continued to plague him long after the interview was over. It made him realize that his movement and his organization, the Interfaith Youth Corps, were running in too small a circle. They were not reaching out to people who were later on the path to sectarian violence. They were reaching out to college students who were already excited and open to interfaith work. So in coming to speak to this room of over 1,000 UUs, people who were on his side when it came to interfaith work, he asked us, who is excluded in the movement that trumpets inclusivity, diversity, and relationship building? And while he was asking this of the interfaith movement, I think he also could have been asking this of us as a faith movement, about who we exclude on our path to inclusivity, diversity, and relationship building. So I think in order to live up to that title of risk taker and movement builder that Patel calls us, we have to take risks and build relationships with those who we deem different from us in ways that we like and in ways that we don't like. We have to think about who we exclude and think of as the other. Who sits outside of our idea of kinship? And I'd like the answer to be no one, but we don't live in that world yet. We can often leave people out who don't fit our way of believing and behaving in the world. It might be people who go against our political positions, or it might be people who are a constant thorn in our side. Sometimes those people overlap and sometimes they don't. And while it's not the job of Unitarian Universalism to provide a spiritual home for everyone, it is our job as human beings to be in conversation with all people and not to demonize people who are not on our side or who don't act in a way that we deem right. We all belong to one human family. But let me be clear, I'm not arguing that we should get rid of the lines that shape our faith. People who are not interested in compassion and connection and hope may not fit into Unitarian Universalism, and that's okay. I am arguing, however, that those people are still worthy of love and belonging in conversation because they are our fellow humans. So in order to arrive at kinship's door, we have to first leave our own comfort zone and think about another question that Patel asked of us. How are all of us, with our beautiful resonances and our deep disagreements, to share a nation and a world together? He reminds us that this work requires us to be a little uncomfortable, but to build relationships in spite of that discomfort. We have to get past what Zen scholar Thich Nhat Hanh calls the illusion of separateness. Buddhism and Shinto, both Japanese religions to start, share the idea that separateness is at the root of suffering. It is only when we draw strict lines between us and them that we begin to stop caring about things which we think affect them and not us. But we are called to awaken from this illusion, according to Hahn, and live in harmony with each other and the world. And this idea of oneness deeply resonates with our seventh principle of belonging to that interdependent web. We are connected to one another and the planet. If there is sometimes something that causes you to suffer or nature to suffer, I experience that pain as my own, as Ellie said beautifully in our meditation. For kinship to occur, I must be able to see the you in me and the me in you. And it's only when we realize that connectedness that we can cease to cause so much suffering. Our own human instincts confirm this desire to belong and to be one with one another. Psychology tells us that it's a basic human need almost equal to the needs for food, clothing, and shelter. It's built into our DNA to seek out connection. We need it in order to survive. We need it in order to grow. We need it in order to be human. And when we connect, we are able to see others as members of that same human family. This was certainly something I needed to relearn on my trip to Japan. But I found that it was in these small, ordinary actions that I was able to realize my connection and kinship with the people there. It was in watching priests say short prayers before and after meals. It was in witnessing the girls who worked at the shrine try to get me dressed the first time I put on my robes, giggling profusely. It was in talking to a priest who spoke very little he spoke very little English, I spoke very little Japanese, but we were able to communicate how much we both liked the latest James Bond movie. These sparks of kinship were only made possible because of the experience and vision of one man, the former chief priest of Tsubaki Grand Shrine, where I studied. Reverend Yukitaka Yamamoto created a program that began hosting UU seminarians almost 50 years ago. And while he passed away 11 years ago, his legacy, through the lectures and speeches that he gave all over the world about the importance of relationship building across the divides of country and religion, were saved and transcribed, and I had the privilege of reading them while I was there. I discovered that Reverend Yamamoto was a soldier in World War II. He witnessed firsthand the violence and trauma that result from a lack of awareness and cooperation with the other. His brother, who was next in line to take over the shrine, was killed in battle, and so the honor of running this almost 2,000-year-old shrine fell to him. And he assumed this work by reaching out to the other. And the other at the time was us, of course, Americans. My grandfather thankfully survived World War II as a medic in the Army. And I'm sure many of you also know family or friends who served during that time, possibly becoming injured or losing their lives. And yet, despite knowing the horrors of this war from our own stories, kinship was realized because of someone who made an effort to get to know people from the other side. And during my 2 weeks at the shrine, the feeling that I didn't belong eventually dissipated, and kinship emerged in its place. The new chief priest today, who I spent time with, continues to carry out the bold work started by his father-in-law, who I mentioned. And he does so especially when he welcomes a young American woman like me into the inner sanctuary of his religion and his own heart. We might not have been able to understand one another's languages and customs, but I knew that amidst these stark differences, we belonged to each other. It was in the sharing of a theology of connection to one another, to the divine, to the earth, sharing a love of sake and laughter, and sharing the value of human growth despite our impermanence. And I'll be the first to admit, it might be easier for me to see how I belong to a Shinto priest than someone of, say, the religious right. A Shinto priest, shares my ethics and values, while others might not operate out of the sense of love and belonging that I deem worthy. It's easy to see that we belong to everyone gathered here who share our vision for a better world, and that we belong to those gathered up at First Unitarian this morning, and we're paving the way for congregational kinship in a sense. But the difficulty comes in recognizing our belonging to the people who are not gathered here or at other UU congregations. We have to learn that we still belong to people who may believe that marriage is between only a man and a woman. We belong to people who are rude or arrogant towards us. We belong to people like George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and everyone in between. Because we are all human, and this faith to which we are committed demands that we recognize each other's humanity and inherent worth before anything else. We are called to hard work, not easy work. The work of building relationships of belonging to people who are different from us. But to do that, we have to think about who those people are for us. And in acknowledging that we see people this way and hold certain prejudices, that is the first step toward awakening to this illusion of separateness in which we currently live. And it's on the path to building that bridge toward kinship. And doing so without becoming paralyzed by guilt is even more essential. And this is a struggle for all of us, including me. I don't want to leave today thinking how terrible I am for considering someone else, someone outside of my idea of right and good, to be the other. I want to leave today believing that every person is actually a beloved member of one human family. The good news is that since we're human, we get to make mistakes. And despite those mistakes, or maybe because of them, we are even more capable to create sparks of kinship. Like Ibu Patel said, we are a people of faith who see difference as enriching. It's in the framework of our principles. So in seeking to widen our embrace, I suggest we start like I did in Japan, with those small, ordinary actions of different people rather than large, complex ideas. And it might look different for each of us. For me, I need to not demonize that person in front of me in traffic on 490 who's going too fast or too slow. Or maybe I need to not imagine myself to be so separate and different from the person that I visit in prison. For others, it might mean not disparaging someone, famous or not, on social media. And yet for others, it might just mean assuming the best intentions of someone who says something that makes your blood boil. It's realizing our commonalities rather than sharply distinguishing our differences that makes kinship possible. In closing, it's my hope that above all, we go forth seeking out connection and relationship with all those who cross our paths before we know how they think, act, vote, or believe, as well as after. Because without connection and relationship to people different from us, the world we hope for and dream about will not be possible. Kinship encourages us to see our shared humanity with others first and acknowledge their humanity as our own. Because we never were separate to begin with. It is only an illusion. Let us remember that we belong to each other. May it be so. Amen.
I invite you all to stay standing and take each other's hands as we say our closing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian.Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.